Okay, what I want you to do is spend a little bit of time talking about marriage before we talk about it as a group. And I want you to kind of do some thinking about what are we actually saying, believing, what do you hear about marriage today? And notice what I have on the board here. These are the three things I want you to talk about. Number one, what is popular culture saying? So these are the things you hear on talk radio. These are the things you hear. Actually, I would throw in most newspaper stuff, though they tend to think they're doing something more than that. I continually am distressed at the level of reporting that you find in terms of a lot of scientific material, social science or natural science stuff in most newspapers. So anyhow, what are people saying? Then what does the Bible say about marriage? That may be in direct response to these things, but that's always a little bit of a bad way to do it. In other words, don't just say, well, the culture says this, let me find something in the Bible that responds to that. It's good to just go to the Bible and say, what does the Bible just plain say about marriage? And then ask the question how the two map onto each other. So talk a little bit about that. And you might even, once you've made those two lists, might even think a little bit about what you would say in response to cultural criticisms. And then this one, what do you learn from studying human marriage, quote, scientifically? That doesn't mean putting married people in a test tube, but rather, generally speaking, sociology, psychology, those are the kinds of places we study marriage simply as a human phenomenon. Oh, anthropology is another big place in which people study marriage. And you would find a variety of claims that come out of those kinds of sources. And you may or may not know these. Logically, I would have put this one over here. You know, talk about what popular culture says, talk about what actual science findings are, then talk about the Bible, so you had those out there. I put this over here as kind of the third thing to talk about because I'm suspicious that a lot of you may not actually have that information at your fingertips. So it would be a very short conversation if that's what you were talking about, because you just don't know that much about that. If you do, feel free to interject that anywhere along the way. So I'm not trying to bracket this as much as just make the observation that that's probably a starting point that may not be as accessible to you as hopefully what the Bible might say about it. So does that make sense? And I will give you a chunk of time to do this, probably 20 minutes. I want you to actually produce some results here because we will put those on the board. And one other thing that will become important as we talk about things today is that same principle really applies to a whole batch of things that are involved in making human society continue and flourish. We tend to think we can take all kinds of things for granted, like perhaps the next generation. But what happens when you stop and realize someone has to make the next generation? And someone has to raise it. Can I just take it for granted? Or do I have to somehow care about that? And is it somehow theologically relevant that God has created ways in which the next generation can be propagated, nurtured, and made to thrive? So those are some of the things that we'll talk about. And all of this really is this issue of trying to say, you know, your theological vision of God is often way too thinly confined to the kind of person who acts in ways that are relevant to Sunday morning worship. And I would like to argue he's a guy who acts in ways that are relevant to a farmer cutting grain and you know, driving it into the silo, to have it milled, to have it cooked, to have it brought to the store, to have it eaten. All of those things are included in kind of a scriptural vision of what God does for us. So anyhow, long side story. Back to grist for the mill. Here's one. Cameron Diaz is right. That's the title of this article. Actress Cameron Diaz, 38, was quoted this week declaring marriage is a, quote, dying institution. Ms. Diaz added, I don't think we should live our lives in relationships based off old traditions that don't suit our world any longer. That is the official statement of Cameron Diaz. Why do I know that? Not because I read things from Cameron Diaz or pay any attention to TV interviews that she might have, but I occasionally do read things from other places, in this case, a Fox News blog. This is picked up by a psychiatrist named Keith Ablow. And remember, Fox News is not exactly the most flamingly liberal version of the American press. And so here's what he is writing, picking up on this. He says, well, I'm not certain marriage ever did suit most people who tried it. From what I hear in my psychiatry office, and from what I hear from other psychiatrists and psychologists, and from what my friends and relatives tell me and show me through their behavior, and from the fact that most marriages end either in divorce or acrimony, marriage is, as it has been for decades now, a source of real suffering for the vast majority of married people. I would go further. I'd venture that 90% of the married patients I speak with would rank their marriages in the top 2 stressors of their lives, while only 10% would rank their marriage as one of the top 2 sources of strength in their life. And then he goes on, and he throws in one more thing. As a healer, I can't help looking askance at anything that depletes energy, optimism, mood, and passion to the extent that marriage does. It is, without doubt, one of the leading causes of major depression in the nation. So, marriage. I have a batch of other marriage quotes. Actually, you know what I'll do is I will read a batch of these quotes, and then I printed these out on a sheet so you have them in front of you while you're talking about this. But this way, I don't have to give you time to just read individually. Just listen up, and then you can take a look at them while you talk. This is from a Washington Superior Court judge in 2004. These are just variations of descriptions or definitions of marriage that we have, because this is another interesting question. How do we define marriage? Is it possible that that's controversial today? So, Washington Superior Court judge. To marry means to join together in a close and permanent way. A close personal commitment. It is intended to be permanent, and such relationships are, quote, spiritually significant. That's the statement of our Washington Superior Court judge. New York Supreme Court. Marriage is the utmost expression of a couple's commitment to love and, quote, a unique expression of a private bond and profound love between a couple. It is, quote, highly personal and the most intimate of relationships. Canadian law. This is taken from Canadian Supreme Court decision. Move beyond the form and focus on the substance is what they call for. This means we don't ask, is the couple married, or does this couple consist of a man and woman living together in a sexual relationship? This is mere form. The substance is, do these individuals care for and support one another? Have they voluntarily chosen to enter into a close and personal relationship? This one is the same vein, so let me read one more here from the LA Times. Marriage as Americans know it today didn't exist 2,000 years ago, or even 200. Rather than an unbending pillar of society, marriage has been an extraordinarily elastic institution, constantly adapting to religious, political, and economic shifts, and pliable in the face of sexual revolutions, civil rights movements, and changing cultural norms. And then finally marriage is a specific relationship of love and dedication to another person. So these are definitions of marriage. Now, I am giving you these kind of in writing just because I'm sure you couldn't reproduce all those after I just read them. And I want you to stop and think, what do you think about these definitions? And not in abstract, ooh, I like that one, or not in generalizations, I like that one, I don't like that one, but think of specific claims that are included in those definitions. Did they get it right? Did they get it wrong? Those are the kinds of questions I want you guys to chew on in your groups for a while, and then we will kind of report on what we found. All right, okay? Let me hear from you guys just a little bit. And we will start over here with, what are the things that popular culture is saying about marriage, and what do you have to say about that? What do you have to say in response to those things? So, yeah, what do you have to say?
I feel like
go ahead.
Popular culture says like marriage is a great experience to be had. So it's all about like, you know, having the best wedding and just like fulfilling all your dreams that you have from your childhood about like what would be the ideal wedding. And it's all experiential. It's not so much based on like you know, a commitment of what am I getting into, but it's more like what am I going to get out of this.
Okay, good. Which is kind of an interesting, I mean, I agree with you in terms of the way, particularly we do weddings. And it is a little bit funny when you think of all the negative things I was reading from, you know, some of those quotes, that we get that excited about such a negative thing, so to speak. So there's probably a certain amount of incoherence about our culture's viewpoints on this, because certain of our behaviors would belie certain other things that we, at the very least, say, if not do. So, okay, good point. What else? Yeah, Brittany.
Some things that we mentioned in our group were just like kind of what you read, and just how a lot of pop culture thinks it's like old-fashioned and
Okay.
like not really important now, or like sees it as something temporary and they can just get a divorce if they need to, or get prenups, which like going into it thinking that you could get divorced. And then we also, someone mentioned like seeing marriage as like a fixer to a relationship.
Oh, yeah.
Or like a fixer, like fixing your life by getting married.
Yeah.
Emotional.
Source of security or things like that. You're feeling insecure. This is a scary world. You want someone to be there with you in it, whatever your combination, whatever needs fixing. Could be financially. That's one reason people for years have married, is partly as a financial fix. Yeah, Ben.
We talked about it just kind of being a formality, because people, most like
Okay.
times in pop culture, they just start living together. So marriage just becomes like a formality. Oh, let's make it official. Let's finally tie the knot.
Yeah. And it is an interesting thing when you have high levels of cohabitation. It becomes a pretty relevant question, why marry? We're already living together. We're already having sex. We're already having whatever it is I want to get out of marriage. Why bother? So it becomes a mere formality.
Like we talked about that, like one of the like why marry. We talked about like some people might just get married for the tax benefits. Like,
Yeah, okay.
It's cheaper to be married than to not. Let's do it.
I'll just put this up here in the general why marry category, and there's a million things we can throw in there. Yeah, probably.
I feel like American consumerism's kind of bled into marriage a little bit, and it's kind of just like picking the right person for you and the right person that's going to make you happy, and more of like a superficial way of looking at it instead of it being a lifelong commitment and someone that's going to help you serve God and serve other people.
Yeah, so that's almost a side effect of you can get a divorce. That's a little bit like, if you notice how it changes your attitude when you're going to buy something, you're not sure if you want, and say, can I take it back? And say, of course, you can always just keep the receipt. And that is very much kind of the consumer mindset with marriage. Can I take it back? The one other thing I'd add with that is that this is not what I bargained for. So 3 years later, you've decided this is not what you bargained for. This is not what I thought the car would be. I want my money back, or else I want to trade it in. So yeah, Courtney.
I think a lot of people are scared of marriage and like afraid of commitment.
Okay.
And culture, and they think, oh, I have to be with this person for the rest of my life, and get freaked out, and that's why a lot of people don't marry.
And what is it that they're afraid of with commitment? I mean, people say exactly that all the time, that people are afraid of commitment. It is interesting to think, what is it that you're afraid of about commitment? Are you afraid that you won't be able to keep the commitment that you're about to make? Are you afraid that the commitment will keep you from finding happiness? Are you afraid that the commitment will be broken on the other part and you'll become the victim of a broken commitment? What is it that you're afraid of with commitment?
I think a lot of times it is the second one, because
Which one was that?
I'm afraid that your commitment will keep you from something bigger.
Okay.
People are always searching for the next big thing, or
Which kind of brings back to the consumer thing then. Ooh, if I buy this one, I can't buy that one. It's like buying a house as opposed to buying a briefcase or something. You really like a new briefcase, you can go get another one. The house, too expensive. You can't really buy two of them. So if I buy one, I can't buy the other. If I get married to this one, I can't get that one. Yeah, sir.
I don't know, I think it's definitely all three too, because I know people and like naturally, like tendencies like to be insecure, it's like, okay, well, I don't wanna commit to something that like I can't keep, or like,
Okay.
there definitely is like too, like, if you commit to somebody and then they break it, then you're broken from that, so there's a lot of like vulnerability and trust that you're not ready to like give, and especially if you don't have God as like that number one, like this is like ultimately who I am. So if it's like everything you're committed to them and they break that, then it's like your identity's like shattered.
Okay. That was a great line. They break the commitment and they break you. I mean, I don't know if that's a great line or a credit. Anyway, well put. However good or bad it may be, well put, yes.
Along with all of this, I think that makes it more of a personal thing than committing to someone else. Like you're scared of commitment, or the consumer mindset, or the trust issue. Like you're still focused on you, that individual, instead of the relationship.
Okay. And this is probably a thing. I'll just call this individualism in marriage. Have you ever thought how fundamentally marriage is a contradiction of individualism? And it's kind of weird that as individualistic as we are, we still actually pursue marriage as actively as we do. So, is there somebody else back there? Okay.
I
Allison.
think a lot of the being scared of marriage and commitment comes from examples. I mean, everyone's been affected
Okay.
by divorce. Whether that's a sibling or a parent, and I think there's a lot of comparing of yourself to other people, and it just makes it easier to think about that and makes it scary.
Yeah, good point. That was that wasn't one of my three, but you're dead right. That's one of those things because we've seen it broken so many times. We're afraid it'll happen to us. Hannah.
I think like one reason why commitment is something that's like so terrifying, I guess, is how it's portrayed in media. Like the idea of like the ball and chain kind of thing. Like this song, this really popular It Girl. Like he talks about this girl and he wants to marry her, and he says like, "Give me 25 to life." So he's like basically saying like, "Give me prison," kind of thing. And so we view it as this like, you're dying to like everything, all of your dreams, and you're just becoming like changed to this one person. And like, I don't know, that's just kind of, I can see how that's.
Yeah. Well, and that is kind of a uncomfortable metaphor of, life sentence. Oh, great. Yeah, Stephanie.
I was just thinking as we were like listing these, that it's ironic at the same time that they have this like almost like negative view of marriage, but there also are people fighting for the right to marry.
Yeah.
That people in same-sex relationships are pursuing marriage as a right that they feel that they have. What the basis of that is, but ultimately that they're seeking that and crave that right for this. So.
Yeah, that is paradoxical, which should make you suspicious that what seems to be going on isn't what actually is going on. There's some other thing going on, because you're right. You look at this list and we're going, why is that so cool? Cambridge.
I think a lot of times culture views love as being the basis of marriage, and like love and happiness instead of commitment. And
Okay.
so those go away, marriage should go away also.
I think I was reading an article where the psychologist was saying that the 7-year itch is now the 3-year glitch, and that because love only lasts like 3 years before people get bored, and that is when they start looking for other people or things like that. And it used to be 7 years, now it's been under 3 because our culture has such a shorter time span for even.
Yeah, well, that's a really dismal statement, but it may very well be true. Ben.
I was going to kind of say the same thing, but I think a big part of it is the media and the way that it portrays marriage. So mostly I'm thinking of like movies where marriage is kind of really not something that people stick with. They
So there's kind of a social programming that almost takes place by media writ large. And I'm always reluctant to demonize media, but I'm also reluctant to underestimate the role it plays. Let me put it this way. Capitalists are way too smart to spend hundreds of billions of dollars a year on media if it didn't influence behavior. And I'm way too smart to believe that if a commercial can influence my behavior in 30 seconds, that a movie cannot magically influence my behavior in 2.5 hours. That to me seems flamingly incoherent. So if I put those two together, then denying the impact of media on our behavior to me just seems to be foolish. Or you've got to make peace with some of the other facts that I just floated out, because I don't understand how it can be that way. Okay, Cambria. Somebody over there. I saw some hand, yeah.
I was going to say also with media, they portrayed a lot as happily ever after, or movies, the couple gets married and then the movie ends, and there's no looking at it. It's actually hard.
Isn't it interesting that marriage in the media tends to mean one of two things? It means happily ever after. In other words, marriage means wedding. And all you see of the married couple is their wedding. Well, we throw rice on them as they go out and the little bells ring and the birds fly and all those cute things. Or marriage means divorce. So the beginning of the movie is the couple breaking up, or the story of the movie is the couple breaking up. And the number of times ordinary, healthy, flourishing marriage is portrayed in the media is perhaps breathtakingly small. Yeah. What else?
Well, like sorry to keep going back to media, but something I've been thinking about lately is just the influence of sitcoms. That either the man is seen as, like the woman is seen as demanding and just screaming at her husband, and then the husband's seen as the lazy man that only wants sex. So it's just they're like, who wants to be married to that? And so it's
Yeah.
portrayal of those things and being bound to someone as miserable and those things. So I don't know. It's portrayed.
That's a good point. There's the third media option for marriage, is toxic background condition in which you can play out a sitcom, which is a fairly common. You think you guys are probably too. You guys seen All in the Family? Archie Bunker. So that kind of a portrayal of some kind of a toxic relationship situation that becomes kind of the backdrop for a story. That's another thing we do. Okay. And we totally mock Leave It to Beaver, right? I mean, seriously. It is just despised. Ozzie and Harriet, Leave It to Beaver. I don't know if you guys ever even watch episodes of those things, but if you do, you realize you're watching out of a cultural context that totally disparages that. The only thing that can be said about it as a cultural artifact is it's such a wonderful example of the oppressive patriarchy. But there's nothing else to be had there other than an example of that kind of oppressive
I grew
activities.
up watching the Bundys, and you know that show?
The
I think it's called the Bundys. Love and Marriage.
Yeah.
What's it called?
Love and Marriage.
Anyways, yeah.
My TV watching experience is
Married with Children.
Married with
Okay.
Children.
Yeah, and the whole thing.
Are you guys naming different shows, or did we decide that show is called Married with Children? Okay, all right. Thank you. For all of us TV neophytes, it's very helpful. Go ahead.
The whole point of this show, and I watched it for years, was marriage was the ball and chain, and the dad of the household always wanted to sleep with the the daughter's hot friends and stuff, and that was always glorified, and it was all about trying to.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this thing, I think Hannah hit the jackpot here. The portrayal of marriage in media tends to be pervasively negative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was actually doing a study on this for another class, but Leave It to Beaver and shows as we've seen how they start out as a nuclear family in the suburbs and how it's progressed to a couple living together in New York or something like that.
And you have to ask the question, a couple of what living together in New York?
Exactly. And shows Leave It to Beaver and contrasted with Modern Family, which is people probably know about that. But it reflects our society and the change we're going through. Whereas right after Leave It to Beaver, a ton of shows don't know, the one you mentioned, All the Children, is that?
All in the Children's a soap opera. All in the Family is the one I mentioned.
Those started becoming popular as families became more broken and more
Yeah.
divorce started occurring in the U.S. So I guess it's, yeah, our like media is reflecting what we're going through.
Yeah, I mean, media, you see this all the time with commercials. A commercial can't violate people's expectations or desires, but it does want to not leave them with the same expectations and desires they had when it started, right? Because that would be a total wasted commercial. The goal of a commercial is to take you from wherever you are to one step closer to buying the product. So it is designed to move you somewhere, but it has to meet you at your starting point. And if you violate that by too much, you just tune it out and don't pay attention. So that is, in terms of media shaping culture and culture shaping media, it isn't simply a one-way relationship, and it is certainly not an arbitrary relationship. In other words, you have to enter into the dance properly, so to speak, to be able to actually influence. What else? Anything else over here from you guys? Biblical comments or comments about this? Maybe you've given me some comments about what you feel about this already, but anything you want to say about what the Bible has to say about this?
We were kind of talking about how it's interesting how we have this idea of getting married to the one, where I don't really see any place in the Bible that says you can only be married to one person. I feel like any male and any female that put God first could be married forever. So I don't think it's, I don't know if God only has one person or if he's like, there's 10 people you can get married to, pick one.
Let's do the quick opinion poll. How many people here like the idea, only one person, there's got to be the one for me? This is not a thing that you have to be shy or embarrassed about. This is not. You believe the idea.
Like a soulmate?
Yeah, you know, God has one person who's really right for you.
Like good luck finding.
Don't go too wild with this thing about that. Okay, and how many people think there could be many people who are right for you?
Not every person,
Okay.
but many people.
But many people. You'd like to put a few writers on that claim before we start down that road. Okay, got it. Yeah, sure.
Though, like, what I think you're saying is true, it's definitely going to be easier with some people than it is with others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, and that, so I don't think that means, like, oh, like obviously I think there should be, like, so much discretion in that, but, like, there's, like, I think God can keep the marriage together, like, no matter what. I think there's certain times that you should leave, like in situations of abuse or like cheating or like just any like bad unrepentance where like you can't like do anything else on that, like on your path. But yeah, some are definitely gonna be easier and like better in a sense.
I'm just picking up something you in effect said there. I get the impression that for us talking about no fault divorce is easy. What we're saying here is divorce is exceptional. In other words, it should absolutely not be anything like a norm or an expectation, biblically. And I'm not trying to answer the question here about all the nuances you might give to, is divorce and remarriage possible? What exactly the grounds are divorce? Can it only be one thing, two things? Is there possible for more? I'm just saying wherever you land your airplane, it's going to be in a very exceptional set of conditions that divorce would be permissible, and that's very different than what we have over here. Okay, what else? Yeah.
When people get married, they become one flesh.
Okay, and what does that mean?
Well, basically they become, like, it talks also about, like, the woman belongs to the man belongs to the woman.
And what does that mean?
I don't know.
So she was taken from his flesh, so when they find flesh, it does feel
Okay, let's clarify something. Does marriage have anything to do with sex?
Yes.
Okay, good. Now back to the two become one flesh. What does that mean? Okay, that would be a good answer to the question. 3 letters, very brief and right to the point, okay? This is more important and more contested than you think, and I just want to clear it up for you. Yeah, that phraseology is explicitly sexual. Now, there may be other things that go around that as well. In other words, you don't want it to be merely sexual, and I'm totally fine with that. I just don't want it to be less than sexual, because I think that's just accurate to the statement. Yeah.
One thing we said is when the two people are married and they become one, it's a way of loving people in a different experience, like Christ loved the church. So there's more.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily all about you then, it's more of a self-sacrifice type thing and working with each other. But it's a different way to learn to love.
Yeah, so I'll just call it a special kind of love and not worry about nailing down exactly what that means, but there does seem to be something unique about that, and particularly unique in the way it can model a sort of love that not only Jesus had for the church, but also models certain things about the relationship within the Trinity that Jesus would have with the Father, which is
Piper said
dramatic.
that marriage isn't to make you happy, but it's to make you holy.
I think Gary Thomas said that, but Piper no doubt would quote it.
Yeah. Is that Gary Thomas?
Yeah. That's kind of his thing. And I think he actually is the guy who came up with it. Have you guys read any stuff by Gary Thomas?
Is he the Sacred Marriage guy?
Sacred Marriage guy, yeah. And were you volunteering or were you?
Well, the Psychology of Marriage, and that's one of the textbooks.
Okay.
Sacred Marriage.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Yeah, it's a good book. He's a really good comedian. There's a lot of people who are kind of on the marriage circuit, so to speak, Christian marriage circuit. And some of that is kind of like this weird Christian popcorn version of pop psychology that kind of makes me less than excited. Gary Thomas would not fit in that category.
Something out of that book that would kind of be a response to what the culture says is that like the difficulties and suffering in marriage isn't something to be avoided. To really make your marriage flourish and to learn to love each other and ultimately love God more is like entering into the hard times and figuring out like how to love the other person well and working through those problems.
So they aren't unexpected or merely to be avoided. There's some kind of a purpose perhaps behind those things. Yeah, Courtney.
My church is going through the book of Solomon, and it talks a lot.
Back to the sex thing?
It talks about do not arouse or awaken love until it's time.
Okay.
And just the importance of like waiting to have sex until marriage.
And it also in the book goes through after the couple gets married, it goes through their first conflict or their first fight.
And my pastor just emphasized being able to fight fair with your spouse and what that looks like and how to love each other even though you have conflict and almost to like welcome that conflict like he was saying.
Okay, so a little bit like, these difficulties that, who was it? Was it Ben? Just talking about that. One of those might even be conflict between spouses, not necessarily just external things. Good. Yeah.
I think Paul touches on it a little bit in saying that like it's like you're blessed in your singleness and that your interests aren't divided, and that marriage is can be a challenge in that way that your interests are divided and you seek things not only in the Lord but your spouse, as well as your singleness can be seen as blessed, but also that marriage is a calling.
So both marriage and singleness can be callings. And one of the things, here's a good modern American confusion. We tend to think of calling as the important thing is for you to find your calling. And generally speaking, the answer to the question of where do you find your calling is, you look within. Now, let's examine the word calling. So I pick up my cell phone and I call myself. Anything sound weird with that? So Rick, how are you doing? Oh, great. I'm having a great time with Jesus Lord of All. It's been a really special class today. They talked about marriage. Oh, really? Did you have a good? Oh, yeah, I loved it. I mean, isn't that what we lock people up for? I mean, just like instituted for their own good. Talking to yourself. Who are you calling? Me? It's bad enough if you text yourself too. You know, what in the world are we thinking about when we think we generate a calling? So this is one of these interesting things. Once you talk about singleness being a calling and marriage being a calling, you realize that, oh, it isn't necessarily all about my free, personal, individual choice. It's about me picking up the phone and hearing what the message is. And the message could be single. And the message could be married. And God could have a purpose for both. Yeah, Chelsea.
Another thing to kind of go with that is in Genesis where God says Adam shouldn't be alone. It's kind of like God just setting his calling maybe and gave him someone to be with. But it wasn't good for Adam to be alone. So that could be applicable to other people.
Yeah, well, and I think in the context of the creation story, it's pretty clear it's not good for human beings to be alone. The only thing you would say about that is that, so then if you're talking about a single person, you would assume they would still be living in society in relationship with other people. It would still not be good for them to, quote, be alone. But yeah, and I think marriage is clearly the culminating design for the solution to the problem of aloneness. It isn't merely friendship, but rather marriage that really, culminates the creation narrative. So yeah, Brittany.
I think kind of just going off of what she said too, like with right around that, I think it's like in Genesis 1 or 2, like there's a very clear picture. It says that like God brought Eve to the man, and that's like the first kind of like symbol of the marriage of like God the Father bringing the bride to Adam. And I think just that kind of shows that like God designed marriage and like completely ordained it from the very beginning of time. And so it kind of is interesting how what Steph said, how like even though culture has like a really negative view on marriage, there's like people still fighting for marriage, and just like this like intrinsic like need to be married and like how we were designed to be married,
Yeah, it is a really interesting thing. There's a lot of these kinds of things. We did the thing with Oprah talking about truth, and kind of a similar thing where you have all this language destroying truth, and then suddenly you see this person just flipping out because someone lied to them. No apparent sense of irony here. And I think it's similar with these kind of things with marriage, our need for that sense of solving our aloneness. We weren't meant to be alone. That I think goes pretty deep in us. And I think we have this deep sense that marriage really is fundamentally the answer to that question. And even if everyone doesn't have that particular way of answering as what God's ordained from, there is a sense of, but that's what it's there for. And that's the big deal. Okay. Any questions that you have? Okay, so here, well, let me go this way. Batch of questions that come up, I hear a lot. Is marriage ultimately just a cultural convention? In other words, an arbitrary, non-universal things. Easy analogy is to think of human languages, where you realize languages are just kind of, they're arbitrary, they're no deeper than the culture that invented them. So is marriage in that sense like a language where there's nothing particularly deep about it? Is marriage constantly changing? Is it a moving human institution, or is there some sort of coherent core that you can trace back through vast quantities of time? And if you look at these two together, you realize one is asking the question, is marriage universal in a way that you might call synchronically, which means all at the same time. So you look at a whole bunch of different cultures all right now and say, is marriage all the same thing right now? This is a way of testing the same question, the universality of marriage, by looking backwards diachronically through time and saying, is marriage the same thing it was 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago? That kind of a question. Is marriage exploitive to women? Is it a byproduct of the patriarchy, a means of keeping women exploiting women, keeping women barefoot, pregnant, and in the kitchen, as the saying goes? Is marriage essentially about love? Is that the central core, the bullseye of marriage, so to speak? Is marriage essentially personal and therefore not a proper sphere for law and government? In other words, you'll hear people say, you know, the thing that we need to do with government, and we don't need to legalize same-sex marriage, we don't need to make it illegal, we just need to get the government's nose out of marriage altogether. It's just not the kind of thing the government should deal with. That's another big question I think we have. Is sex a fringe benefit or essential to marriage? Interesting question. And it has become far more important in the gay marriage discussion, actually, for an interesting variety of reasons. Are children a side effect of marriage or the central or perhaps a central purpose of marriage? You know, because not every marriage has a kid. So could marriage really be kid-centric or kid-incidental? And then the question you guys drummed up about marrying the one. Is there kind of one person there for me to marry? Any other questions that are grinding on you that you say, boy, I'd really like to get this question answered? Yeah.
How would you define marriage? Like, do you need society to validate a marriage in order for marriage to be official, or can you just make a commitment to somebody in the eyes of God and you guys are married?
Okay, and so this in some ways is related to this legal side of the public legal side of marriage. Should it be a public legal thing, or is it just a more of a personal private thing? Okay, yeah.
How does your view of marriage shape the way you seek someone to marry? Like the whole process of finding
okay.
someone. How should someone find someone?
Okay. How does your view of marriage shape your partner choice? Yeah, probably.
Just I guess we don't have time, but the whole egalitarian, complementarian thing, women submitting to the man.
Okay. And we'll just say roles in marriage. And part of that question is, are there any predefined roles in marriage, or are there specific differences in marriage? Yeah. Let me begin by trying to provide a biblical theology of marriage. Then what I want to do is shift and ask a question: if this is what the Bible says, how does it match up with what you might infer from study of the world? And by this I don't mean worldliness or pop culture, but literally studying the world, both human sociology and psychology, but also human biology and physiology. This is actually a remarkably important feature of framing a discussion of marriage. You remember me using the illustration before about what counts as arbitrary, and people talk about clothing as being sort of an arbitrary cultural thing. And then I asked the question, so how many armholes do they have in a shirt in Thailand? Do you have to go check? Or do you already know the answer to that question? Because human beings have two arms. And you suddenly realize, oh, they may be different colors, they may be different sizes, they may be different weights, they may be different fabric, but if it doesn't have two armholes and a neck hole, it's probably not a shirt. And for all the arbitrariness, there's something incredibly fixed about it given human nature. And that's the interesting question to ask with marriage. Obviously, there's many things that are different about marriage. You look at marriage rituals or wedding rituals, and they're different. You look at how things, are teased out in different societies. There's differences, but is there still some kind of a very central core functionality to it? So I want to talk about that issue. And then we will conclude by talking about some of the benefits of marriage, how that is actually teased out in practical society. Because in some sense, that isn't so much an argument from human nature as a confirmation of the argument you just made. In other words, if you end up arguing that a certain kind of marriage is more fundamentally compatible with human nature and design, that should in some sense be proven by the fact that it works better for human beings. And so you can measure a lot of quantitative markers for any variety of issues related to human thriving, from physical health to financial health to mental health to social health. All of those things are things that you can in some sense count, weigh, and measure. So we will look at those kinds of things to try and answer those questions. So that's the plan. Let me begin with the Bible. I'm going to offer a definition of marriage that I will probably have to defend or explain a little bit. This is not designed to roll off the tongue. This is more of one of these more academic definitions. But here it is. Marriage is a divinely ordained human institution, which, I'm sorry for the typo there, which unites male and female in a lifelong, exclusive, sexual, procreative union, which is legally recognized, socially necessary, and personally beneficial. That's my operating definition. And let me just make a couple of quick comments about that definition. One of them right at the top, I think is really important to get clear on. Marriage is a divinely ordained human institution. So this definition is making an important claim about marriage, and that is that marriage is fundamentally a human institution, not a Christian institution. So that means a guy like me who thinks a thought like that might bristle when a pastor in a church, an evangelical church, would say something like, I don't know how anyone could possibly make marriage work in today's society unless they were a Christian. I want to ask the question when I hear that, well, is marriage a human institution or a distinctively Christian institution? Because if it's a human institution, I think it'd be a very terrible thing if God had ordained that for human life, but the only people who could actually do it were Christians. That would seem somehow like God had a really bad sense of humor. And he created this thing for all people, but only let a small, tiny portion of them be able to actually successfully do it. Is marriage designed for humanity and Christian marriage a subset of that? Or is real marriage Christian marriage and all other marriage is a cheap knockoff, probably designed by Satan to, seduce people into doing practices contrary to God? So my contention here is that it is actually a human institution. It is not a distinctively Christian institution. And the reasons for that we'll make clear in just a second. Male and female are obviously embedded in this, and we'll see why from a biblical standpoint again in just a few minutes. And then just identifying a set of features related to marriage. And I think it's always a little bit of a danger to say, well, what's the one thing? What is the essential thing? You know, some things just don't have it. What is the essential thing of a family? A mother and a father? Kids, sibling, what do you want to do with that? So you realize there's a set of things that go into a family, because a lot of people have a mother and a father, but you look them in the eye and say, whatever else I had, I sure didn't have a family. And you realize there's an element of truth in that story. So are you thinking that marriage will simply reduce to one thing, or is there a set of things? So I'm giving you a set. One is about its duration. One is about its nature. It's exclusive. Second thing about its nature is that it's sexual. And it also defines a certain aspect of sexuality. It's procreatively sexual. That doesn't mean that everyone succeeds in that enterprise, because, well, we don't have control over procreation. We have control over sexual intercourse, right? The part that we have volitional control over is not actually the production or non-production of kids. We just make that more or less likely by other activities that we participate in. So that which is legally recognized, socially necessary, and personally beneficial. And I'm simply here pointing out three fundamental aspects: a legal aspect, a social, broader social aspect, and then a personal aspect to marriage. So let me talk through where those, I think, are potentially found in Scripture. If you think a key biblical text for marriage, at the top of the list would probably be Genesis 2. 19 through 24. So this is where Adam has been spending the whole day naming the creatures, and he goes through all that work, and no helper suitable for him is found. And you just want to stop and think at this point. By the time he's done naming the animals, he's come up with names like rhinoceros. How many animals had he seen by the time you're pulling up names out of the hat like rhinoceros? I mean, he has really had his full of these things. And it is at this point that God, you can see God crafting in Adam a frustration in this story. Yes, he's naming the animals, but the most irritating thing to him is every time he sees an animal, he sees a paired animal. And he is an unpaired animal. And it's like God is beating the drum for Adam's lack of a partner. And then he causes the sleep to fall upon the man, and then he takes out the rib and he closes up the place with flesh, and then he creates the woman from the man, and she'll be called woman because she was taken from man, and he presents her to Adam, and Adam says, "Whoa, baby!" That's kind of the Hebrew translation into modern contemporary language. But there's a big element of that in that story because of this sense of longing that is built up in it as the narrative is told. And he really is looking for something here, and pow, there's Eve. And it's like, this now is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman because she was taken out of man, and for this reason the man will leave his father and his mother and be united to his wife, and the two are going to become one flesh. So that's the story there in Genesis chapter 2. What are some of the things you learn in that? Well, number one, why do I call it a human institution, not a Christian institution? Because you had marriage before you had any Christians, right? Adam and Eve weren't Christians. There wasn't Christianity at this point. There wasn't even Judaism at this point, right? This is pre-religion in that sense. This is in the original creation order. And that is why I argue that this is a human institution for all people, not exclusively attached to a single religion. And in fact, my expectation coming out of this would be that as I look at different religions, the thing that would be most striking about them relative to marriage is how similar the marriage conventions and expectations are. Because the argument here is not that those marriage things marriage institutions grew up within a religion, but rather that the marriage institution grew up before the religions, just as a matter of chronological fact. Marriage was there first, and all the religion and religious diversity was there second. Not, of course, that people didn't have a relationship with God. Adam obviously did have one, but Adam had the delightfully religion-free one. He went for walks with God in the morning. Kind of a cool setup, right? And this is pre-fall, but notice marriage is pre-fall. Kind of an interesting picture that is painted there of marriage in terms of where it's located in the biblical narrative. So, those are some things that I think when I come back to listing a few things, we'll come back to Genesis 2 a little bit, so I won't go into any more detail there. Another thing to note is that you have in the Bible provision for divorce included in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. And that is a explicit part of the Mosaic law, that in effect the treatment there is saying that if you are going to divorce, you have to give the wife that you are divorcing a certificate of divorce, and it in effect it really has to happen, and it is also prohibition of going back to that person that is stated there. And really the thing that you want to note as you look at that is you're seeing in the biblical narrative there, not so much in Genesis 2 because it doesn't really have laws yet, but in Deuteronomy 24 you quickly see marriage as very much of a legal institution and not merely an informal social institution, because what is attached around it is a whole set of legal kinds of requirements, in this case attached to divorce, but I am pointing it out here merely for the issue of saying they understood marriage as very much of a legal union between two people that required a legal document if it was going to be dissolved, and no doubt entailed a legal document in the forming of it as well. Now, it may or may not have been a written document. We'll talk about in a second how some of those things were formed. Second, covenant and marriage. Yeah.
Can you just repeat that one time? You're saying it was a legal institution and not so much, how did you describe it?
Not simply a matter of, kind of personal engagement and commitment or something like that. It wasn't a private thing, and it wasn't merely public in the sense of a thing that you did out in the open. You did it in a legal sense of public. Covenant and marriage, clearly books like Ezekiel and Hosea and other things like that develop a huge amount of parallel between the marriage relationship and God's covenant relationship with Israel. And so part of what is being portrayed within marriage is the nature of an actual covenant, and God's relationship with Israel in some sense is a model. God's commitment to Israel is some sense of a model for what should be practiced in human marriage. Just as a little side note again, as people talk about, so this point merges into the ancient Near East background of marriage. So without denying one of the biblical themes defining marriage is the covenant commitment, let me talk a little bit about the ancient Near East context in which marriage grew up. Number one is the issue of the covenant and the contract. It is not uncommon to hear pastors say things in a wedding ceremony such as, you are not merely entering into a contractual relationship with one another, but you are entering into a covenant with one another. Have you heard that language used in weddings that you've heard? And usually they will define that difference as a contract is a two-way horizontal commitment between two individuals. And a covenant has a three-way element. There's a vertical dimension to a covenant that is lacking in a contract. Now, as a description of marriage, I am happy to sign on to the program of marriage being covenantal in that definition, that there should be a vertical element to your marriage, ideally at the very least, not simply the horizontal element. The only thing I'd like to point out is that in the ancient Near East, the word covenant and the word contract are the same word. There's only one word there. So you can't make a coherent distinction between covenant and contract in the Old Testament context because they're one and the same. There's only the one word. And furthermore, I think from a biblical perspective, as you read through the Old Testament, read through books like Proverbs, you have this very clear sense that when you are making a pledge to another person, that is not merely a horizontal activity in the Old Testament. There is always a vertical element to that. And so what really I'm saying that we have gotten wrong when we make that distinction isn't we've gotten covenants wrong, but we've gotten contracts wrong. That anytime you're giving your word to another person, there's an element of, to move it into Jesus terminology, of let your yes be yes and your no be no. And anything more than that, these magical appeals to other places, is really a thing that's emanating from sin. You need to have a vertical element every time you give your word. So I do want to make sure that we think of this broader kind of vertical pledge that you have attached to the marriage union. At the same time, I want to point out that that doesn't really actually make it different than contract. And fundamentally in the Old Testament, well, in the Bible in general, marriage is very much of a contractual relationship. It has all the legal overtones of that, and it doesn't seem that different than that. And it's kind of a weird artifact of our later language that we can so easily split apart covenant and contract. That really didn't happen until you had a whole self-standing legal institution that was completely independent of a church. And that became the domain of the church over there, and the legal contract world carried its own weight over here. So that is ancient Near East context for that. Let me make a couple of comments here. I already said my piece about covenant and contract. Let me talk a little bit about bride price and dowry. Number one, the reason I include this here is that bride prices and dowries were exchanged exactly as a part of a legal contract. In other words, that is exactly what it was all about. It was very much of a legal transaction, and there was an exchange of goods and services, or in this case, money and commitments, in the context of creating this marriage covenant, this marriage contract. So the bride price was the amount of money paid to seal the betrothal, and was paid by the groom to the father of the bride. And that usually averaged about 10 shekels, which would be for a subsistence level worker about 10 months worth of wages. So it was a significant amount of money that is being paid in this frame. And notice that is being paid by the groom to the father of the bride. And you call that the bride price. Now, the second thing that was exchanged, in other words, the reciprocal contribution into the contract, was the dowry. And the dowry, in effect, goes in the opposite direction in a rather interesting fashion. So it is paid by the father of the bride to whom?
The groom's family.
Paid by the father of the bride to the groom's family. Any other guesses? That's coded for that was wrong, Brittany, I'm sorry, but you probably already picked up on that.
To the bride.
Yeah, interesting thing about the dowry. It is paid by the father of the bride to the bride. Now you may be thinking, well, that's screwy. Let me explain the idea behind the dowry. In fact, let me do it by way of an illustration. I'm in India, and I had a couple interesting experiences with marriage in India. I lived there for 6 months and went back there a couple times. And my first encounter was with a batch of people with Campus Crusade for Christ. And because I was with Campus Crusade at the time, and they had a whole bunch of Indian nationals who were at a training center where I happened to be for a couple of weeks. So we got to know each other a little bit, and we'd talk to them at breaks, and we were in two different, kind of training things, but we'd see each other and befriend each other. And so I was talking to this one guy about, what's going on in his life, and he said, oh, I'm really excited. I'm going to be getting married in November. And I said, oh, cool, who is it? He says, well, I don't know yet. Thomas hasn't chosen her. Thomas was Thomas Abraham, the national director for Campus Crusade for Christ. And at this point, my skin begins to crawl up and down my back because I suddenly realize the director of Campus Crusade for Christ is arranging marriages for his staff. And I am thinking, call Bill Bright, call God, I don't know, call someone because this can't be right. And of course, as I dig around a little bit, I discover a couple interesting facts. Number one, 90% of all marriages in India are arranged. Number two is that they are almost always arranged by not the father, but usually like an uncle. So a respected, male representative of the family negotiates this with the person on the other side, but it's always easier to say something that needs to be said to the uncle rather than the father, so to speak. So it has usually got this person one tiny bit away from just nose to nose mother and father, dad's conversation. So that's all cool, but the problem is if you convert to Christianity from Hinduism, which almost all these guys did, they would be kicked out of their families. And suddenly you have no one to arrange a marriage for you. So what do? You logically go to your uncle sort of figure. And in fact, you would find a lot of these folks calling them Uncle Thomas, Thomas Abraham. In fact, I have kids who are not mine who call me Uncle Rick. There are people here at Biola who would call me Uncle Rick, who I am not uncle to, but I've known them for their whole lives. I remember them holding them when their diapers needed to be changed. I remember being in the hospital when they were born. These are kids I've known for a long, long time, and they respect me as a uncle-like figure. So that's kind of a cool thing, and it was perfectly logical for him to do the arranging of the marriage. But for me as a modern American, that was a freak out moment. Because I thought it came down from heaven that all marriages should be arranged by the two parties to fit their personal desires and would always be born of pre-existing love. And the notion that your marriage partner would be chosen by someone else and that the operating assumption is that you would grow to love each other. And the only question you could ask yourself when you were about to get married is not, is this the right one, but am I ready yet to sustain that kind of a commitment? I realized I was in a really, really different society. The other thing I discovered that was really, really different was the idea of a dowry. And I pretty much just blew my little mental gasket when I found out dowries were going back and forth, but I never bothered to find out anything about them until a later trip. When I was talking to this guy he was significantly older than I was, very well respected pastor and leader in that area. And we were having this conversation. His daughter came out to feed us, or to bring us something to eat. we got to talking about his family and his daughter in particular, and says, yes, she's getting, married in the near future. And we started chatting a little bit about that. By then I was, didn't even bother asking if it was an arranged marriage. I assumed it was, no big deal. Then he just pauses. One thing I've never understood about you Americans. And I go, what's that? Well, it's about dowries. I'm going, oh, this should be an interesting conversation. He says, I don't understand what you do with your money and why you do it that way. He says, you guys, the parents keep all of their money for their entire life, and then when they die, they give it to their children. Well, by that time, their children are all 60 or 65 years old, and they don't need that money anymore. The time they needed that money was when they first got married, because they couldn't buy a car, they couldn't buy a house, they couldn't do anything they needed. And, what we do in India is we give our daughters a dowry, which is their portion of the family inheritance. It's a ton of money. It's a third or a fourth or a fifth, depending on how many kids you have, of a person's net worth. That's a wad of cash. For this guy, the way he gave the dowry was literally to buy her and her husband a house. That was her dowry. He says that way they get their money when they need it. I don't understand you people. Can you explain? And I'm like, blah, I don't know. Seems something like an incredibly intelligent question that I had absolutely no intelligent answer to. And I look at this, my kids right now, my son's engaged. My daughter's at that age as well. And you're looking at this and going, man, that makes a ton of sense. Now, the interesting thing, as we mentioned when we started this, though, is that the money is paid by the father to the bride. So notice the logic of this in terms of family inheritance. This is her portion of the family inheritance. How much is it? Generally speaking, you don't weigh this in ancient Near East society in money, because people didn't have that kind of money. What they had is some sort of familiar resources. So you would find a lot of these marriage contracts written up with something like this as a dowry. She will get the apple orchard north of the road. And so it is a piece of land that is designed to provide sustenance for the family unit. And that is the inheritance, that is the dowry that this person gets. Now, you may say, well, look, there's a patriarchal society. What difference does it make if you give the money to the woman and the man has all the control over it? Why don't you just be honest? They give the money to the man, okay? Well, back to the issue of the legal side of this, and also the issue of contracts, and in this case, particularly divorce contracts. So here's the scoop. Yes, in a patriarchal society, the man probably did have authority over how not only that resource, but any other resources they had. Ultimately, he had the legal responsibility for how that money would be spent. But if the man chooses to divorce the wife, you know what is in effect held in escrow? That if you disband the marriage, reverts back to the starting point? The dowry. So go ahead and divorce the woman, but she gets the dowry back. And then the guy's saying, fine, I've just had it with you anyhow, so I divorce you. So great. And then the girl quietly asks, well, so where are you going to live? Well, what do you mean where are you going to live? I built this house with my own hands. Yes, but you built it in the apple orchard north of the road, which is mine now. So I was just curious where to forward your mail. And suddenly the guy starts sputtering, and suddenly he starts thinking, you want to go to counseling, honey? Because the idea of giving up the apple orchard and the house that he did indeed build with his own two hands suddenly sounds very unattractive. And what does the dowry become? An incredible incentive to keep the marriage together, number one. Well, in a sense, yes, but it's really not at all designed to say what happens when we divide. It's really designed to say don't divide. The secondary function of it is to protect the woman if you do divide. That way, though disenfranchised in many ways in a patriarchal society, she is not left without resources because that dowry, that inheritance, reverts back to her. And she has some way to live. Now, back to the issue of marriage, I just want you to get that clear in your head. Whether you like it or not isn't the issue I'm asking right now. whether you like dowries and bride prices, or you feel like you're buying and selling a human being. I get the anxiety about buying and selling human beings. I just want to stop and ask, once we understand how this was designed to be structured, is this designed to be an oppressive way to keep women down and in their place? Or is this designed to be a social protection for the welfare of the women involved? And I would like to argue it was very much designed to be a social protection for the women involved in marriage. And also, generally speaking, a protection for their children. Because the children are going to stay with the woman, and that way this is also provision for the children to be taken care of, as well as the wife who might be estranged. Now, was that the way it always worked? Did people cheat on these things? I mean, you don't even have to ask the question, right? Of course people broke, bent, and distorted these rules. And you find a great example of this. This is all looming in the background of Jesus' discussion with the Pharisees about marriage. Can a man divorce his wife for any and every reason? Notice what they're asking there sounds like a question about the technical requirements for divorce. Now that you've heard all this, what are they really asking? If I can divorce her for any and every reason, that means she broke the contract and I get the dowry. In other words, the dowry was relinquished by the person who broke the contract. You commit adultery, you lose the claim to that. If you divorce your spouse because of adultery, you get to keep the dowry. You have broken the contract. So, in an ancient Near East society, if you have the privilege, if you want to call it that, of divorcing your wife literally for any and every reason, for any displeasing thing you find within her, that was the Hebrew core of the discussion. And the question is, what does that mean? And the idea was that literally this was an interpretation of one of the rabbis. In effect, if she burned your dinner and you're upset, you can legitimately divorce your wife. And Jesus is like, time out. That is so wrong. What God has put together, let no man put asunder. It was not this way by design. And even the provision for divorce that Moses gave you was because of your hardness of heart. But it's not to be applied to any and every circumstance. And really what he's doing is reinforcing a very narrow interpretation of that passage. It attaches it only to adultery, or interestingly enough, the other, in terms of historically, the other grounds that would be equivalent to that were a refusal to have sex with the wife. In other words, if a man is not having sex with a woman, if a man is not providing shelter or food for her, those were the other legitimate grounds for divorce. And that's an interesting parallel actually to what Paul talks about with abandonment. A spouse is abandoning is no longer providing for those kinds of things, and also obviously no longer giving conjugal rights. So those are some of the things that are embedded in this ancient Near East background that I think is really, I think honestly it is simply intentionally misread in our culture today, because we want to demonize these kinds of structures, and when someone is exchanging money over a marriage certificate, we just almost intentionally read it in a distorted fashion as if you're buying the girl. Or dowries are, the father of the bride is so desperate to get rid of her that he pays someone to take her. I've heard all kinds of people giving that sort of an account of a dowry. And I just want to clearly point out, whatever you feel about this description, just understand that this is what the dowries were intended to be. This is how they were designed. And read and respond to that, not whatever hypothetical version you drum up with about those things. Questions or clarifications on that? Okay. New Testament teaching, Romans chapter 7, talks about, one of the things you get from there is grounds for divorce or illegitimate grounds for divorce. Do you not know, brethren, I'm speaking to you who know the law, that the law is binding only during a person's life. Thus a married woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she's discharged from the law concerning her husband. Accordingly, she'll be called an adulteress if she lives with another man while her husband is alive. But if her husband has died, she is free from the law. If she marries another man, she is not an adulteress. And so you are getting a reminder there of the attachment of adultery The concern here, the way you break the contract is obviously in this context with a death. They're very concerned with this tendency to paper over infidelity with divorce and remarriage. This is a way that you can, in effect, have serial polygamy. Instead of having multiple wives at the same time, you just have multiple wives in sequence. You get rid of one, then you get the next, then you get the next by multiple divorces and remarriages. This whole thing is not a thing that seems very attractive to the biblical eye. There's a batch of other things to say about that, but I want to take the time to do that right now. Narrow grounds, lifelong commitment for marriage. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, you have again the issue of adultery as grounds for divorce, and then the second one that Paul adds is if the unbelieving spouse departs or leaves. So in all of these cases, what you have is a very, very restrictive opportunity for divorce. And as I mentioned over there in our comments, at the very least, what you want to conclude is that divorce would be very exceptional, not in any way normal in the biblical context. That's part of why we then call it a lifelong institution, because old age, getting tired of the old booger, those things don't count as adequate grounds for divorce. It's intended to be lifelong. And I mentioned this with Jesus and rejecting the teaching of Hillel. So that's a quick read of the biblical background. Let me just put this into that original definitional framework, biblical teaching, the original definitional framework we gave for marriage. First of all, the personal side of this, the two becoming one flesh. I mentioned this when we talked about Genesis chapter 2 before. This building sense of longing for Adam that is completed with the arrival of Eve. And you can sense almost this deep internal psychic longing, very personal longing that Adam had that was designed to be met in the context of a marriage relationship in the person of Eve. So that's part of why I attach that to the personal side of marriage. Two becoming one flesh make this a very sexual, not simply a personal, emotional longing kind of thing. It is a sexual and a procreative union of two people who are complementing one another. The two only become one heterosexually, right? I mean, at the risk of being overly graphic, you do this and the two remain two. You do this and the two remain two. You do this and the two become one, right? So that's the picture. And that is, I'm sorry, but that's just explicitly what is being referred to in that context. It's a very sexual connotation that is referring to conjugal sex. Let me look if there's an... Yeah, and then similarly with 1 Corinthians 7, clearly a sense that marriage is partly there for fulfilling sexual desires. So it talks about burning with passion and things like that, and marriage is in some sense a solution to that. So all of these elements attached to this kind of personal side of marriage, that are something that you have on the inside that is fulfilled in the context of a marriage union. And this seems to be, again, part of God's design for marriage. In terms of the legal side, as I mentioned, ancient Near East marriage was always a contractual event. And this is true not just in the Old Testament, but really, if you were to compare Old Testament law, and I think I have quotes from David Instone Brewer in your notes, so you at least have that name. If you want to read up a little bit more on ancient Near East marriage practices and how they compare to biblical ones, there's a good source. But the easiest rule of thumb is that just assume they're broadly speaking the same. Marriage in the ancient Near East and marriage in the Bible was well nigh identical. Variations in terms of certain provisions regarding divorce, variations regarding how the dowry is viewed. Some of the protections for the women that I was just talking about are less found in other settings because divorce is easy and kind of no faulty. So there's some of those kind of variations, but the basic design of it being contractual, being it sexual, being it personally fulfilling. All those things are part of marriage in the entire ancient Near East context. So what was I? Yeah. So with the legal side of this, it's protection of the legal standing as well of the next generation. One of the interesting things that marriage does is it secures, it entrusts the womb of the heir to the family, heir not with an E-R-R-O-R, but an H-E-I-R. It entrusts that power to the legally blessed woman. In other words, this woman may not have control over where her husband spreads his seed, to put it crassly. She doesn't, as a matter of fact, have control over those things. But the one thing that the legal standing does actually guarantee her is standing over who will actually inherit, because that person is going to come out of her womb. However many other spawn this guy may have, the one who inherits the family continues the name. If he happens to have an entitlement to some deed, whatever the aggregate production of the family is, this person is legally protected as the offspring of her womb, because she is the one that you're legally married to. A concubine doesn't have that claim. A prostitute's offspring doesn't have that claim. It's a protection, again, for the legal standing of the wife and the child, and her children in particular, that is built into the marriage contract. Social side of marriage, generally speaking, in the Bible, it is foundational for all of human society. So, interestingly enough, when you think of the place, amazingly, in a place like Israel, who do you entrust the really, really important task of teaching people the Torah? That's a big deal for the Hebrews. And the question is, so who's going to do this absolutely vital to our life mission task? Well, Deuteronomy 6:4, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And then it talks about teaching this stuff to your children. And who is it who does the teaching? The rabbi? No, you're to teach this to your children as you walk along the path, as they lie down, as they get up, in all the ordinary tasks of ordinary life. Ordinary people are going to be teaching their children God's extraordinary law. That has been entrusted to their care as parents, to teach their children the law, which is the essential thing that keeps Hebrew society together. So this educational function is entrusted to the family. Furthermore, if you go on through the Old Testament, you'll find that military organizations were structured by the family, right? You read Numbers, you read Judges, you read all these places where you have this military census. How many troops did you have? How is it divided? It's divided by clan. This is how many Gad drummed up. This is how many came from Asher. This is how many that came from Manasseh and Ephraim. All of those organizational structures in the military are always grouped by their family clan structure. Likewise with legal courts and things like that. You see Moses trying to figure out how is he going to solve the problem of all the complaints people have against each other. Well, they appoint elders from different tribes and clans. And you go to your clan tribe sort of leader, and if that doesn't work, you can appeal to Moses. But the point is the legal structure is basically family based. It is, that family clan. Public works, when Solomon decided he needed to get forced labor from Israel to build a temple and to build his palace, all of that was organized around the tribes of Israel, family based. So government administration, legal courts, military things, public works, education, all of those human social institutions are founded on the family unit. If you think of the nation of Israel in the most literal of sense, echoing up and down the corridors of nation of Israel's history, and every human institution they developed throughout their theocracy were the names of the 12 children of Jacob. That's how everything was organized, foundation to the society. So it's a huge issue there in biblical society. Another thing to think about is the multiply, fill command of Scripture. Not only is this in the Genesis 2 narrative, obviously one of the big problems with man being alone is that man was giving the command to multiply and fill. How's Adam going to do that? Real problem there. He's not multiplying anything on his own. Eve is required in order to multiply. But as you begin to think about that, you realize, you know what, you don't really just need Eve, because human societies don't really just need two, they need like the kids too, and then you need the structure in which to build the kids. And you realize the multiplying and filling task of humanity is not done by solo pioneers, but rather by colonizing family units. One of the most telling differences between the two different immigrations to the New World, quote, the Spanish immigration and the English immigration. Spanish immigration went to South America predominantly, but the interesting thing was it was largely made up of adventure-seeking young men alone. What did they do? They went and shot lots of people and they got a lot of gold, and their entire plan all along was to get whatever they needed so they could move back to Spain and live. The people who came over to Massachusetts Bay Colony, all married couples, and they had no intention of ever going back. They were coming to a new world to live and to colonize and to make it a home. And the hallmark of that posture is exactly the issue of having families, reproductive units, not just having spouses, but having spouses who together have children. And that is how you multiply, fill, and colonize the world. If you ever see, space sci-fi movies, you can always tell when they're just sending somebody off to go shoot some cool laser cannons at some other person, because you can have a nice, male guy shooting around. So you think of Star Wars, and so you have Han Solo and you have Luke, and they're just blasting the snot out of anything that moves slow enough in the cosmos. But then they tell other sci-fi stories about we're going off to planet Witchmadoodle because we just destroyed our original planet back here. And in all those colonization stories, what have you got? Male, female, and children. Completely different thing going on in that spaceship, because you just need that to fill that function. So on all of these counts, you see this kind of interesting, complex set of things that are all grounded in the human institution marriage. On the one hand, things for personal satisfaction. On another hand, legal issues. On the third hand, all of the social structure of society that has its roots in the marriage and family unit. Now, a couple of correctives in all this for modern Christians. We have a knack for making marriage all about our personal preferences and happiness. Let me just put all three of these up here, in fact. We tend to follow our culture in reducing marriage to a thing to make me happy. How do I decide who to marry? By whoever I think will make me happy. How do I decide what constitutes a marriage? Isn't this interesting? What do? We write our own marriage vows. Who gets to decide what marriage is? I do. Who gets to decide how long to stay in a marriage? How many times have I heard people say, I'm not happy in my marriage anymore, and doesn't God want me to be happy? And my personal happiness becomes my guide for the duration, the nature, and the initiation of my marriage. It happens in the world, it happens in the church. And I would like to argue that that is an enormously sub-biblical or unbiblical understanding of marriage. I remember a particular exchange that took place when I was a pastor with someone in our church, and they came to me because they were having marriage problems, and they began to describe fairly dispassionately. You never know what you're going to get with marriage counseling, because I've had people screaming at each other. I've had people screaming at me in these kinds of settings. But this couple was fairly dispassionate because they just both completely agreed about their situation. And their situation was that they really don't love each other anymore. In fact, it's been a long time since they really felt anything for each other. And they've really just been living together for the last 6 or 8 years. They've just been keeping together for the sake of the kids. And so they told me that story and said, yeah, it sounds reasonable. So what is it that you wanted to talk to me about? And they're like, well, I mean, like we said, we're not happy in our marriage anymore, and we're just keeping together for the sake of the kids. And I said, yeah, I get that, and I think that's a really good idea. I really want to commend you for keeping together for the sake of the kids, because they need you. And then things got awkward. And it's like, don't you care that we're not happy? Like, well, I don't know, define care. I mean, here's the question. Why did you think that marriage was supposed to be happiness-centric? I don't know if you guys have ever seen Band of Brothers, the movie about the guys from the D-Day invasion. There's this interesting episode in there where they're all hunkered down in the Ardennes forest in the middle of the winter. They're all freezing to death. It's just a terrible situation. And this one whole episode is about the medic. And he goes bouncing from foxhole to foxhole in this episode, talking to the different guys. And it's really interesting, the questions that he asks him. I mean, he's running around when sub-zero weather. The German howitzers are dropping these 88 millimeter howitzer shells on them, blowing everything up. So you're not going to go running around just for the fun of it. So when he drops into the other guy's foxhole, what do you suppose he asks him? Well, all kinds of questions like, he's the medic. You keeping your socks dry? Oh yeah, well, show me your feet. Are you really keeping your socks dry? Because trench foot is a huge problem. And these guys lost more people at trench foot than they did to German bullets. Not that they died, but they ended up having to sent back home because of the destruction that happened to their feet because of these kinds of things. Do they have enough food? And he keeps asking all these kinds of questions. The one question he never asked in that whole program is what? Are you happy? And I just want you to picture these guys sitting here. They've been hunkered down for 8 weeks. The Germans are shelling them. They're eating their shoe leather. They're trying to keep their feet from falling off their legs. And some knucklehead drops into the foxhole and says, are you happy? It's happy. Wow, happy? I don't even know where to start on that one. But does that mean he doesn't care about their feelings? Here's the question he's really asking: how's your morale? There's a good question for a soldier. If he dropped in and asked him, how's your morale, they'd know what he meant. And they basically is asking the question, can you still keep fighting? Do you have what you need to keep fighting? That's the morale question. It's a mission-centered question. Do you have what it takes to keep fighting? And it is nauseating to me that we can no longer ask people that question in a marriage. But the only question we seem to know how to ask them is not, how's your morale, but are you happy? Isn't life supposed to be about something just a little bit grander than happiness? If you want happy, go to Disneyland, for heaven's sakes. Don't go join an army. And I assume all those guys in those foxholes thought, I thought I enlisted for something bigger than happy. I thought I was supposed to go kill Hitler because he's destroying Europe, democracy, and everything else we hold dear. I don't know. I thought there was something bigger here than my happy. And there was. And I would like us as Christians, as we think about our marriage and our families, to think there's something bigger here than our happy. And it's not that we shouldn't, as pastors and as friends, care about one another's morale. We should. But I'm far less excited about finding out the answer to the question of how happy are you? Because usually if you persevere and maintain your morale, you'll find that happiness will come along. In fact, it's a fascinating finding of what happens when you get wildly unhappy couples who go ahead and stay in the marriage, and then you compare them 5 years later to people who are wildly unhappy and went ahead and got a divorce. You know who's happier? People who stayed in the marriage. And you know what else? 80% of those people now rate their marriage as either happy or very happy, though 5 years earlier they were about to divorce. So happy is a terrible thing to shoot at. It's a wonderful thing to have come alongside while you're shooting at something a little bit more fundamental and a little bit more important. So I worry that we have followed our culture in making marriage about all these other things and missing the target about the big thing.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.